It's time to free you from the burden of decision-making, my daughter-in-law, Chloe said. The words dropped onto the polished surface of the boardroom table like pebbles of ice. That word, free, it didn't land like a kindness. It sounded like remove. My son, Leo, my only child, nodded in agreement. His nod was shallow, quick, a little bird pecking at my heart, and then they clapped. All of them, the new board members Chloe had so carefully selected. They applauded my exile from my own life's work. I didn't say a word. There were no words. My throat felt like it was packed with dust. I just looked down at the documents in front of me, at the crisp, black and white bank statements. I saw the name of the foundation, the Arthur Legacy Fund, named for my husband, and beneath it, the line that mattered, sole signatory, Beatrice Wallace. They wanted me to be passive. Fine. I would be the most passive, most silent, most immovable object they had ever encountered. I would watch, passively, as they tried to access an account that was now, for all intents and purposes, a block of ice. The meeting ended. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor felt like a final verdict. People stood, stretched, began to talk in those bright, false voices people use when they've just done something ugly and want to pretend it was necessary. Leo came over, put a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy, not reassuring, just heavy. Come on, Mother. Have some champagne. We're celebrating a new chapter. A new chapter. Yes, the one where the author is written out of her own story. I allowed him to guide me from the boardroom into the adjoining reception area. The air changed instantly. It was thick with the scent of Chloe's expensive perfume and the smell of hors d'oeuvres, little bits of smoked salmon on tiny, perfect circles of bread. The clinking of glasses was a constant, cheerful sound that made the silence inside my head feel even louder. I didn't take a glass of champagne. I found a wingback chair in the corner, a little away from the main cluster of people, and Saturday. It was the only thing I felt capable of doing, sitting, breathing, watching. My body felt like an old, heavy coat I couldn't take off. From my corner, I had a perfect view. I was a ghost at my own funeral feast. And Chloe was in her element. She moved through the room not like a person, but like a current. She laughed, her head tilted back just so. She touched arms, squeezed shoulders. She was holding court, and the court was mesmerized. She was already the queen. I watched her gather a small group, including 2 of the most influential board members. They stood near the grand window overlooking the city, their champagne flutes catching the afternoon light. I was too far away to hear every word, but I didn't need to. Chloe's voice carried. It was a voice designed to carry, to cut through the chatter. The first thing we need to do is reinvent our public image, she said, her hands painting a picture in the air. I'm talking about a complete rebrand, a major charity gala. We'll book the grand ballroom at the Pierre, get a real celebrity to host. We need press. We need prestige. We need to get the fund's name out of the society pages and into the headlines. A man in a gray suit nodded enthusiastically. A ball is a brilliant idea, Chloe. It raises the profile. Exactly, she beamed. This isn't about just quietly giving money away anymore. It's about creating a brand, the Arthur Legacy brand. People need to see that we're a major player in the city's philanthropic scene, quietly giving money away. That's what Arthur and I had built this on. We started it with the money from his life insurance. It wasn't a brand. It was a promise. A promise to a man who spent his life as a doctor in a city clinic, who believed that help should be given without fanfare, without needing a photograph or a plaque to prove its worth. Our first grant was for a new set of incubators for the pediatric ward at St. Jude's. I remember the letter from the head nurse. She didn't talk about prestige. She talked about the sound of tiny, healthy lungs. Leo drifted over to Chloe's circle. He stood beside her, looking proud, looking owned. He caught my eye from across the room and gave me another one of those small, placating smiles. Then he turned back to the group. "Chloe's right," he said, his voice a little too loud. "My father was a humble man, but the world has changed. To do good, you have to be seen doing good." A cold knot formed in my stomach. He was using his father's memory to justify destroying it. He spoke of humility while planning a spectacle. The irony was so bitter it almost made me gag. Then Chloe did something that sealed my decision. She gestured to an aide who began handing out thick, glossy brochures. They were beautiful. The paper was heavy, expensive. On the cover was an artist's rendering of a grand ballroom filled with elegant people in tuxedos and gowns. The title, in a swirling gold font, read, "The Arthur Legacy Gala, A New Dawn, A New Dawn." It looked more like a long, dark night. Leo broke away from the group and walked over to my chair. He crouched down beside me, holding one of the brochures. He smelled of champagne and ambition. "See, Mother?" he said softly, as if speaking to a child. "It's going to be wonderful. We're going to take what you and Dad started and bring it to a whole new level." He tapped the glossy cover. "Isn't it beautiful?" I looked from the brochure to his face. My son's face. The face I had loved since the moment I first saw it. But right then, I couldn't see the boy I'd raised. I saw a stranger. A man enchanted by his wife's glittering mirages. He saw a picture of a party. I saw the cost of every dress, every bottle of champagne, every crystal chandelier money that wouldn't be buying medicine for a free clinic, or books for an after-school program, or warm blankets for a women's shelter. I didn't answer him. I just stared at the brochure in his hand. My silence made him uncomfortable. He shifted his weight. "Look, I know this is a change," he continued, his voice losing some of its confident edge. "But you've been working so hard for so long. You deserve a rest. Let us handle the burden now." There it was again. That word, burden. To them, my life's work, my connection to my dead husband, my entire purpose for the last 2 decades, was a burden. He must have seen something in my face then, a flicker of the ice that was forming around my heart, because he stood up abruptly. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "enjoy the reception. We're all very excited." He patted my shoulder again, a hollow gesture, and walked away. I sat there, watching them celebrate my obsolescence. I felt a small, almost imperceptible touch on my hand. I looked down. It was my granddaughter, Sophia, Leo, and Chloe's daughter. She was 17, with my husband's serious eyes. She hadn't said a word during the entire meeting, just sat in the back, watching. Now, she stood beside my chair, her hand resting gently on mine. She didn't look at me. She looked out at her parents, who were now posing for a photo with a board member, their smiles wide and bright for the camera. Sophia's eyes were filled with a deep, profound shame. She squeezed my hand, a quick, firm pressure that said everything she couldn't say out loud. It said, "I see you. I know this is wrong. I'm sorry." In that one silent gesture from my granddaughter, I found the last piece of strength I needed. I wasn't just fighting for Arthur's memory anymore. I wasn't just fighting against the insult and the betrayal. I was fighting for her, for the future, for the idea that the legacy, the real legacy of quiet kindness, would not be buried under a mountain of canapes and press releases. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze back. She looked at me then, and I gave her a small, slow nod, a promise. After a while, the noise became too much. I stood up, My legs felt steadier now. The coldness inside me wasn't a weakness. It was a structure. It was steel. No one noticed me leave, except Sophia. As I walked towards the door, I saw her watching me, her expression a mixture of sadness and hope. The drive home was quiet. The city blurred past the windows, a smear of lights and noise that felt a million miles away. When I got home, the house was silent. It was always silent now, but this was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on, the old habit of a lifetime. But I didn't want tea. I just needed the ritual. I stood by the counter and looked at the old framed photograph on the wall. It was of Arthur and me, taken 30 years ago. We were standing in front of a half-built community clinic, a project we had supported with our own savings. We were both covered in a light dusting of sawdust, and we were grinning like fools. We were so happy. Not because we were getting our picture taken, but because we were building something real. I thought of Chloe's glossy brochure, of her talk of a brand. The kettle began to whistle, a long, piercing scream in the quiet house. I turned off the flame. I didn't need the tea. My mind was perfectly, chillingly clear. They had voted to make me a founder emeritus, a title, a name on a wall, a relic. They had given me a new role, the passive honored ghost of the Arthur Legacy Fund. Fine, I thought, as I stood there in the silence of my kitchen. I will play the part you have given me. I will be passive. I will be honored. And I will be the ghost that haunts every single transaction you try to make. I will be the signature you cannot get. I will be the silence that drains your bank account dry. They wanted a new dawn. I would give them a long, cold, and very, very expensive winter. Guess. The next morning, the silence in the house felt different. It was no longer the quiet of a peaceful life, but the charged stillness of a held breath. I made coffee, the motions familiar and grounding: scoop the beans, grind, pour the water. But the aroma didn't bring its usual comfort. It just smelled like coffee. The world had been drained of its simple pleasures overnight. I knew what they would be doing. Chloe would have woken up energized, a list of tasks already scrolling through her mind like a stock ticker. The gala, the rebrand, the conquest. Leo would be right beside her, catching her enthusiasm like it was a contagious, wonderful fever. They wouldn't be thinking of me, not really, not as a person. They'd be thinking of me as a problem that had been neatly solved. An old piece of furniture moved gracefully into a dusty attic, given the honorific of an antique. My first instinct, the mother instinct that has been wired into me for 40 years, was to call Leo, to ask him, "What have you done? What were you thinking?" But I stopped myself. My hand hovered over the phone, and I saw it for what it was, a lifeline to a person who had already let go of the other end. Calling him would be an act of pleading. It would be weak. It would be exactly what they expected of the gentle, aging matriarch they thought I was. So, I did nothing. Instead, I went into Arthur's old study. It's a room I don't use much anymore. It's mostly just shelves of his medical journals and a large solid oak desk. In the bottom drawer of that desk is a filing cabinet, and inside that cabinet is a box filled with 2 decades of gratitude. I pulled it out, the cardboard heavy in my hands, and carried it to the kitchen table. I sat down in the same chair where I had made so many decisions, paid so many bills, written so many checks for the foundation. I opened the box. The smell of old paper and ink rose up to meet me. Inside were hundreds of letters, thank you notes, Christmas cards, photographs of smiling children and grateful parents. I pulled out a thick, worn manila folder labeled Community Outreach Grants under $1,000. These were my favorites. They were the small ones. The ones Chloe would have called insignificant. The ones that never got a press release. The first letter I picked up was written in careful, looping cursive on thin, lined paper. It was from a woman named Maria, from a women's shelter in the Bronx. I remembered her application perfectly. Their ancient refrigerator had finally died, and they'd lost all their perishable food. They needed $500 for a new one. We sent the check the same day. "Dear Mrs. Wallace," her letter began, "I don't know how to thank you. When I opened your letter, I started to cry. It's not just the refrigerator. It's that someone out there knew we existed. It's that someone cared. The women here, they feel so invisible sometimes. Your gift made them feel seen. Now we have fresh milk for the children's cereal. It is a small thing, but to us, it is everything." I folded the letter and placed it carefully on the table. $500 for fresh milk. And Chloe wanted to spend tens of thousands on ice sculptures and champagne fountains to impress people who didn't need impressing. I spent the next hour like that, sifting through memories. A check for a wheelchair ramp for a veteran. A grant for art supplies for a classroom in a low-income school. A donation to an animal shelter to cover a month's worth of food. Each letter was a testament to the real legacy of Arthur Wallace, a legacy of quiet, effective compassion. With every letter I read, the steel in my spine grew colder, harder, more absolute. This wasn't about my pride. This wasn't about being pushed aside. This was about defending the very soul of what Arthur and I had built. Around 11 o'clock, I knew the first move would be made. Not by me, but by them. I could picture it so clearly, I might as well have been a fly on the wall. I imagined Chloe and Leo striding into the Foundation's small, unassuming office. Mr. Pike's office. Mr. Howard Pike has been our accountant since day one. He's a man of about my age, meticulous, quiet, with spectacles always perched on the end of his nose. His office smells of old paper, strong tea, and lemon polish. He is a man who believes in rules. He believes in ledgers and receipts, and the unwavering logic of numbers. Arthur trusted him completely, and so do I. I could see Chloe sweeping in, her vibrant energy sucking all the quiet air out of the room. She would give Mr. Pike her most dazzling smile, the one that was meant to disarm and command simultaneously. Leo would be behind her, trying to look authoritative. "Howard, good morning," she'd chirp. "We have some wonderful news. The board has approved a new direction for the fund. We're kicking things off with a major fundraising gala." Mr. Pike would look up over his spectacles, his expression unchanging. "A gala. How festive." "Exactly," she'd say, missing his dry tone completely. "So we need you to process a payment right away. It's a $50,000 deposit for the ballroom at the Pierre. Here's the invoice." She would slide the paper across his perfectly neat desk, expecting him to simply take it and process it. An employee following an order. In my mind's eye, I saw Mr. Pike pick up the invoice. He'd study it for a long moment. He would not be impressed by the hotel's letterhead. He would only see the number, $50,000. He'd know, down to the penny, how many school lunch programs that could fund. "I see," he would say, his voice mild. "So if you could get that wire transfer done today, that would be wonderful," Chloe would add, a hint of impatience in her voice. Mr. Pike would set the invoice down. He would turn to his filing cabinet, a real one, made of gray metal, not a digital folder. He would pull out a thick, bound document, the Foundation's charter, the bylaws that my lawyer and I had spent months drafting all those years ago. He would place the binder on his desk and open it to a specific page, a page he knew by heart. He would put his spectacles back on, though he didn't need them to read the words. A very interesting project, to be sure. He'd begin, his voice still quiet, still calm. However, I must draw your attention to the Foundation's bylaws, specifically Article 8, Section 3. He would run a bony finger along the line of text. It states, quite clearly, any and all transactions, expenditures, or financial commitments exceeding the sum of 1,000 United States dollars requires the personal, handwritten signature of the founder and sole signatory, Mrs. Beatrice Wallace. He would pause, letting the words settle in the suddenly silent office. I do not have her signature on this invoice, he would conclude, looking from Chloe to Leo. Therefore, I'm afraid I cannot process this payment, or any payment of this magnitude. Without her signature, I cannot release a single cent over the specified threshold. Chloe's smile wouldn't vanish. It would freeze. It would become a brittle, cracking thing. Leo would blink, confused, as if the rules were a foreign language he'd never thought to learn. They had planned a coup, but they had forgotten to read the Constitution. My phone rang, pulling me from my reverie. It was a little after noon. I looked at the caller ID. It wasn't Leo. It was Mr. Pike. Beatrice, he said, his voice the same as always. Calm, steady. Howard, I replied, a small smile touching my lips for the first time that day. How are you? I am as I always am, he said, though I have just had a rather stimulating visit from your son and his wife. Oh, I said, my voice full of polite, passive curiosity. They wish to host a gala. They presented me with an invoice for $50,000. He paused. I informed them of the logistical requirements outlined in Article 8, Section 3. And how did they take that news? I asked. They were displeased, he said, which from Mr. Pike was the equivalent of saying the building had caught fire. I believe they will be contacting you shortly. Thank you for letting me know, Howard. And thank you for your diligence. It is my job to uphold the charter, Beatrice. Always, he said, and we hung up. I sat at the kitchen table, the thank you letters spread before me like a suit of armor. I didn't have to wait long. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, it was Leo. Mother, he said, without any preamble. His voice was tight with annoyance. We have a problem. Do we? I asked. Yes. Mr. Pike won't release the funds for the gala deposit. He's being ridiculous. He says he needs your signature. Well, yes, I said, my tone perfectly reasonable. That's in the bylaws, dear. It has been for 20 years. There was a frustrated silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Chloe whispering angrily in the background. Look, Leo said, his voice strained. This is just a technicality, an oversight. Can you just come down to the office and sign the form? We need to get this done today. I picked up Maria's letter from the shelter. I held it in my hand, its thin paper a tangible reminder of what was at stake. I don't think I can do that, Leo, I said softly. What? Why not? He demanded. Because yesterday, you and Chloe made it very clear. You wanted to free me from the burden of decision-making, I said, using their own words, twisting the knife they had so kindly handed me. You granted me the status of founder emeritus. I'm an honorary figurehead now, remember? It would be inappropriate for me to interfere with the new management's decisions. The silence on the phone was longer this time. It was the sound of a dawning, horrified realization. This is not a burden, Mother, he finally sputtered. This is a signature. To you, perhaps, I said. My voice still quiet, still calm. But a signature is a decision. It is an approval. And I am no longer in the business of approving things. You said so yourself. You have the power now. You figure it out. Before he could argue further, I said, I have to go now, dear. I'm very busy enjoying my retirement. And I hung up the phone. I looked at the letters on my table. I looked at the photograph of Arthur on the wall. They had wanted me to be passive. They had wanted me to be a silent, honorary figure. They had given me a role, and I intended to play it perfectly. Second us. After I hung up on Leo, I didn't move. I simply sat at the kitchen table, my hand still resting on the receiver of the old landline phone. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was profound. It was the kind of quiet that follows a slammed door, a space filled with unsaid things, with the ringing of a final, irrevocable word. I knew this was just the beginning. I had fired the first shot in my quiet war, but I had used their own weapon, their own pronouncements, their own carefully chosen words. They had built the trap, and I had simply refused to walk out of it. The phone rang again barely 10 minutes later. I didn't need to look at the caller ID. It was Leo. Mother, don't hang up, he said, the words coming out in a rush. The annoyance was gone, replaced by a strained attempt at reason. Look, I think we've had a misunderstanding. I don't think so, Leo, I said, my voice even. I understood you perfectly yesterday. No, you don't understand, he insisted. Mr. Pike is just being difficult. He's an old man. He's stuck in his ways. If you just call him and tell him it's all right, that we're the new management. He isn't being difficult, dear, I interrupted gently. He is being correct. He is following the rules. The same rules that have protected this foundation for 20 years. The rules you seem to have forgotten to read. I heard him take a sharp breath. This isn't about rules, Mother. This is about progress. We have an opportunity here to do something big, and you're letting some dusty old bylaw get in the way. That dusty old bylaw was put there by your father and me for a reason, I said. The warmth in my voice was gone, replaced by something colder. It was to prevent the fund from being used for frivolous things. It was to ensure that every major decision was made with care. Frivolous? A charity gala that could raise millions is frivolous when the cost of the party could fund a dozen small charities for a year. Yes, to me, that is the definition of frivolous. He was silent for a moment. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head, trying to find a new angle of attack. But before he could speak, the phone was snatched from his hand. Beatrice. The voice was sharp, cold, and utterly devoid of any pretense of affection. It was Chloe. I don't know what kind of point you're trying to make, but we do not have time for these games. The Pierre needs the deposit by 5 p.m. today, or we lose the ballroom. We have caterers on hold. We have a guest list. You are jeopardizing months of work. That sounds like a burden, Chloe, I said, my voice placid. What? She snapped. A burden, I repeated. All those decisions, all that pressure. It sounds exhausting. I'm so very grateful that you and Leo have taken that off my shoulders. As you said, you wanted to free me. The line went so quiet I thought she might have hung up. But then I heard her breathe, a long, slow hiss of fury. We need your signature, she said, her voice low and dangerous, and we need it now. That's the thing, Chloe, I said, leaning back in my chair, looking at the pattern of sunlight on the kitchen floor. You voted to make me passive. You made me an honorary figurehead. Honorary figureheads don't sign checks. They don't make decisions. They smile for photographs and are spoken of in the past tense. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot take my power and then demand I use it for your benefit. This is absurd, she hissed. This is precisely the situation you created. I finished for her. I am simply playing the role you assigned to me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a great deal of resting to do. I hung up the phone. This time, I knew they wouldn't call back immediately. The siege by telephone was over. The next phase would be in person. Logic had failed. Pleading had failed. Now would come pressure. I stood up and walked from the kitchen into the living room. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked its slow, steady rhythm, a sound that had measured the seconds of my life in this house for 50 years. It was the heartbeat of my home. It was calm. It was constant. I decided to be the same. I went back to the kitchen and filled the kettle. I took down my favorite teacup, the one made of fine, translucent china with tiny blue forget-me-nots painted around the rim. It was part of a set Arthur had given me for our 10th anniversary. Holding it always felt like holding his hand. I made the tea with deliberate care. I warmed the pot. I measured the loose leaf Earl Grey. I waited for the water to come to a perfect boil. The ritual was calming, a small act of order in a world that was threatening chaos. As the tea steeped, its fragrant steam filling the air, I felt my resolve solidifying. I was not the angry, emotional woman they probably imagined me to be, throwing a tantrum because my feelings were hurt. My feelings were far beyond hurt. They had settled into a kind of cold, clear certainty. I carried my tea into the living room and sat in the armchair by the window, the one that looked out onto my garden. The roses were still in bloom, their heavy heads nodding in the gentle breeze. I took a sip of tea. The warmth spread through my chest, and I waited. It took them 45 minutes. Enough time to drive from the city, their anger simmering with every mile. The doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly chime. It was a hard, impatient press, a sound that demanded entry. I set my teacup and saucer down on the small table beside my chair. I stood up and walked to the door, my steps unhurried. When I opened it, they were standing there, framed by the afternoon Sunday. Chloe was in front, her posture rigid, her expensive handbag clutched in her white-knuckled fist. Her face was a mask of polite fury. Leo stood just behind her, his shoulders slumped. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the welcome mat. "Hello," I said, my voice neutral. "I wasn't expecting company." "We need to talk, Beatrice," Chloe said, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. Leo followed her like a shadow. "Of course," I said, closing the door softly. "We can talk in the living room." I led them back to where my teacup was waiting. I sat back down in my armchair. They remained standing, a pair of accusers in my quiet space. "Beatrice, this has gone far enough," Chloe began, dispensing with any attempt at civility. "You're being childish. You're holding this foundation hostage because you're upset." I took another sip of my tea. The porcelain was warm and smooth against my lips. "I'm not holding anything hostage, Chloe. I'm retired, remember? This isn't retirement. This is sabotage." She shot back. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? We have made commitments. We have told people things are moving forward. Then perhaps you should have understood the mechanics of the foundation before you announced its new direction," I said calmly. Leo finally spoke, his voice pleading. "Mom, please, just sign the form. We can talk about everything else later. Let's not do this." "Do what, Leo?" I asked, looking at him directly for the first time. He flinched. "What am I doing, other than what you asked of me? You wanted the responsibility. Here it is, all of it. The glamour of the galas and the drudgery of the bylaws. You'd rather burn it all to the ground than see it thrive without you. Chloe accused, her voice rising. This is just petty revenge from an old woman who can't stand being irrelevant. The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder, marking the seconds of the silence that followed. I looked at Chloe. Her mask was gone. This was what she truly thought of me, an irrelevant old woman. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My calm was my weapon. On the contrary, Chloe, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I would do anything to see this foundation thrive. I am doing it right now. I am protecting it from you. I am preserving your father's legacy, Leo, from being turned into a vanity project. I placed my teacup carefully back on its saucer. The small clink of china on china was the only sound in the room. You seem to be under the impression that you are in a position to make demands, I continued, my gaze steady on both of them. You are not. You came into my house uninvited to tell me how to dispose of my husband's memory and my life's work. You have miscalculated. I stood up. They both took an involuntary step back. I am not signing anything. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until I am satisfied that the fund is in the right hands, being used for its true purpose. You want to be free of my burden. Well, I am now free of yours. The meeting is over. I looked toward the front door. I believe you know the way out. Leo looked utterly broken. Chloe just stared at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. For the first time, she had come up against a wall she couldn't charm, bully, or buy her way through, and she didn't know what to do. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out. Leo lingered for a second, his mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came. He just gave me one last, miserable look and followed his wife. I listened to their car start, the engine roaring to life before peeling away down the street. The house was silent again, but this time it was the silence of victory. I walked back to my chair, picked up my teacup. The tea had gone cold. It didn't matter. I had all the time in the world to make a fresh pot. After the door closed and the sound of their car faded into the afternoon quiet, the house felt enormous. The victory was hollow, the silence heavy. I knew this wasn't the end. It was an armistice, not a peace treaty. They would regroup. Chloe was not a woman who accepted defeat. She would simply reclassify it as a temporary setback and find a new line of attack. They would be back. And next time, their desperation would make them even more reckless. I washed my cold teacup and put it away. I walked through the quiet rooms of my house, the rooms that held 50 years of my life. I wasn't just defending a foundation. I was defending this, my life, my memories, my peace. I couldn't spend the rest of my days waiting for the next phone call, the next ambush at my door. This needed to be settled. Not in the quiet of my living room, where they could try to turn it into a family squabble, an emotional drama. It needed to be settled in the one place where feelings meant less than facts, the boardroom. My decision was made. I wasn't going to just defend anymore. I was going to attack. I went back to the phone. My hands were perfectly steady. My first call was not to a lawyer, but to a memory. I dialed the number for George Albright. George had been Arthur's best friend since medical school. He was the godfather to Leo, a man whose integrity was as solid and unyielding as granite. He was still a member of the board, though his ailing health had kept him from the last few meetings, a fact Chloe had undoubtedly counted on. He answered on the third ring, his voice a familiar, friendly rasp. George Albright speaking. George, I said. It's Beatrice. Beatty. His voice warmed instantly. How wonderful to hear from you. How are you holding up? I'm afraid I'm not calling for a social chat, George. Something has happened. Something with the foundation. I told him everything. I started with the meeting, the founder emeritus title, the applause. I told him about the gala, the glossy brochures, the $50,000 invoice. I told him about Mr. Pike and the bylaws, about the phone calls and the ugly confrontation in my living room. I laid out the facts, my voice low and even, trying to keep the tremor of rage and hurt from breaking through. For a long time after I finished, there was only silence on the line. I could hear his slow, heavy breathing. He started, his voice thick with a fury that mirrored my own. They're turning Arthur's legacy into a cocktail party for social climbers. They tried to put you out to pasture like an old mare. That's a fairly accurate summary, yes, I said, a bitter smile on my lips. Over my dead body, he growled. Arthur built that fund to put bandages on scraped knees, not to get his name in the society columns. He wanted to help people, Beatty, not impress them. They've forgotten the entire point. I know, I whispered. So, what are you going to do? He asked. His voice was no longer just angry. It was the voice of an ally. Tell me what you need. I need you at a meeting, I said. I'm calling an emergency session of the board for tomorrow morning. Can you be there, George? I need you, Beatrice, he said, and I could hear the steely resolve in his voice. I would crawl there on my hands and knees if I had to. After I hung up with George, I felt a profound sense of relief. I was no longer an island. I made the other calls, speaking to the two other long-standing members of the board, men who had known Arthur, who understood the Foundation's soul. I sent a formal, legally worded email to everyone, including Chloe and Leo, summoning them to an emergency board meeting at 10 a.m. the next day. The agenda item was listed simply, a review of the Foundation's core mission and current executive leadership. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the wolves to walk into it. The next morning, I dressed with care. I chose a simple, dark blue dress and the pearl necklace Arthur had given me. I looked professional, composed, and in control. I arrived at the office building at 9:30. The boardroom was exactly as we'd left it 2 days before, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The air was thick with tension. George was already there, sitting ramrod straight in his chair. He looked frail, but his eyes were blazing. The other two older board members, Frank and Robert, sat with him. They all stood when I entered, a gesture of respect that felt like a shield. We were the old guard, the keepers of the faith. Chloe and Leo arrived at 5 minutes to 10, followed by their new, younger board members. Chloe was dressed in a power suit, her face a mask of cool professionalism, but I could see the tightness around her eyes. Leo looked like he hadn't slept. He saw George, and his face paled. He had not expected this. I took my usual seat, not at the head of the table that was Arthur's seat, and it always remained empty in his honor. I sat to its right. Chloe, in a bold move, attempted to take the seat to the left, a position of equal power. Good morning, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As the email stated, I have called this meeting to discuss a matter of grave importance regarding the Foundation's mission. Chloe jumped in before I could continue. Beatrice, with all due respect, she began, her voice smooth as glass. I think we can all agree that this could have been handled with a simple phone call. There's been a slight administrative hiccup, but Leo and I are fully prepared to lead the Foundation into a new, more dynamic era of philanthropy. A hiccup? A voice rasped from across the table. It was George. He slowly, painfully got to his feet, leaning on the table for support. All eyes turned to him. You call trying to sideline the founder of this organization a hiccup? You call trying to spend $50,000 on a party money meant for sick children a new era? Chloe's composure cracked. George, you don't understand the strategy. I understand, Arthur. George shot back, his voice ringing with power. He pointed a trembling finger at the empty chair at the head of the table. I sat in a dusty basement with that man in that chair, planning this foundation. Do you know what his strategy was? He'd just come from the clinic. He'd seen a family who had to choose between buying medicine for their child or paying their rent. He looked at me and said, George, we have to do something. No press, no parties, just help. That's all. He wasn't a brand, Chloe. He was a doctor. He was a good man. And you are spitting on his memory. The room was utterly silent. The new board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had signed up to be part of a prestigious charity, not to be lectured about the desecration of a dead man's memory. Leo stared down at the polished table, his face ashen with shame. He looked like a little boy who had been caught breaking his father's most prized possession. George's words had destroyed their moral authority. He had reminded everyone in the room what this was truly about. He sank back into his chair, exhausted but triumphant. Now, it was my turn. I let the silence hang for another moment, letting his words sink in. Then I spoke, my voice calm, clear, and absolute. Thank you, George, I said softly. Then I looked directly at Chloe and Leo. You are correct about one thing. I will not be signing the invoice for the gala. In fact, I am officially declaring my position. I took a deep breath. This was it. The declaration of my independence and the reclamation of my life's work. As the sole signatory on this foundation's accounts, a power vested in me by the charter you neglected to read, I am formally exercising my right of veto. The Arthur Legacy Gala project is canceled, effective immediately. All associated expenditures are denied. A collective gasp went through the room. Chloe looked as if I had physically struck her, but I wasn't finished. Furthermore, I continued, my voice gaining strength, yesterday's vote to move me to an emeritus status was predicated on the idea that the Foundation's leadership would continue to honor its founding principles. It has become clear in the last 48 hours that this is not the case. The current executive leadership has demonstrated a profound deviation from the core mission of the Arthur Legacy Fund. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member. The old guard was with me. The new members looked lost, realizing they had backed the wrong horse. Therefore, I said, delivering the final, decisive blow, I am calling for a new vote. A vote to nullify yesterday's decision and to restore my full and unconditional executive authority as director of this foundation, effective immediately. I stood up, placing my hands flat on the table. I was no longer the quiet woman in the corner. I was the founder. I was the authority. I was the legacy. All those in favor, I said, my voice ringing with a power they had never heard before. Say aye. It's late. The word hung in the air of the boardroom. Aye. It came first from George, a low, firm rumble. Then from Frank and Robert, almost in unison. And then, surprisingly, from one of Chloe's younger board members, a woman who looked at me with a newfound respect. The others abstained, their silence a confession of defeat. It was more than enough. The vote was passed. Chloe didn't say a word. The color had drained from her face, leaving behind a sallow, waxy pallor. She stared at me, her mask of cool superiority shattered into a million pieces, revealing the raw, ugly shock beneath. Leo wouldn't look at anyone. He just stared at his hands, folded on the polished mahogany of the table, as if they were the most fascinating things in the world. He had been present at his own disinheritance. "The motion is carried," I announced into the ringing silence. "Business for today is concluded. The next quarterly board meeting will proceed as scheduled." I gathered my papers, my movements deliberate and calm. The old guard, my allies, waited for me. George gave me a small, proud nod as I passed. We walked out together, leaving Chloe and Leo sitting in the ruins of their short-lived kingdom. We didn't look back. The days that followed were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the hum of a well-oiled machine returning to its proper function. I didn't gloat. I didn't send angry emails or make recriminatory phone calls. Revenge was a bitter, unsatisfying meal. I was interested in rebuilding. My first act was not to punish, but to reinforce. I spent 2 days with Mr. Pike and my lawyer, reviewing every line of the Foundation's charter. We closed loopholes. We strengthened clauses. We made the mission statement to provide direct and unpublicized aid to those in need, so ironclad that no future board could ever mistake a cocktail party for charity. But I knew that documents and rules were not enough. A legacy isn't protected by paper, it's protected by people. I had been so focused on preserving Arthur's memory that I had forgotten to plan for the future. A future that would one day exist without me. My son had proven he was not the heir to my values, but his daughter, Sophia, had shown me where the real legacy lay. At the next scheduled board meeting a month later, the atmosphere was starkly different. I sat in my rightful place. Chloe and Leo were there. They had to be. Their board positions were statutory. But they were neutered, powerless. They sat at the far end of the table, silent observers at a meeting they had once planned to command. The very geography of the room had shifted to reflect the new reality. They were no longer at the center of power. They were on the distant periphery. After we dealt with the usual financial reports, I cleared my throat. "I have a new proposal to put before the board," I announced. "I've been thinking a great deal about the future, about ensuring that this foundation remains relevant and connected to the communities we serve." I saw Chloe tense up, a flicker of the old defiance in her eyes. She probably thought I was about to propose some other dusty, old-fashioned idea. "It's clear that we need fresh perspectives," I continued. "We need to hear from a generation that understands the challenges of today's world. Therefore, I am proposing the creation of a junior advisory board. Its purpose will be to identify and research potential new projects, to be the eyes and ears of this foundation on the ground, and to present their findings to us for final approval." The older members nodded, intrigued. Leo just continued his intense study of the tabletop. "This is not a token committee," I said, my voice firm. "It will have a real budget for research and a formal role in our proceedings, and I have already selected its first chairperson." I paused and looked down the long table. "Sophia, would you please join us?" The door to the boardroom opened, and my granddaughter walked in. She was nervous, but her back was straight, and her eyes were bright with purpose. She carried a simple notebook in her hands. She took the empty chair beside me, a chair I had deliberately left vacant. A murmur of surprise went through the room. Chloe's face was a study in controlled shock. She looked at her daughter as if she were a stranger. "Sophia has been a dedicated volunteer at the Children's Memorial Hospital for the past 2 summers, I explained to the board. "She has seen firsthand the needs of the patients and the staff. She has the compassion and the insight that this foundation was built on. I can think of no one better to lead this new initiative." I then turned to Sophia. "For your first task, I would like you to prepare a formal proposal outlining the most urgent needs at the hospital. Forget what the administrators ask for. I want you to tell us what the nurses need, what the children need, what would make a real, tangible difference in their daily lives. You have 1 month. Sophia looked at me, her eyes shining with a mixture of awe and determination. Yes, Grandma, she said, her voice clear and steady. I can do that. It was a turning point for me, for the foundation, and for my family. The work with Sophia became my new purpose. It was a joy I hadn't realized I was missing. We didn't just meet in the boardroom. We went out into the world. We visited the hospital together, and I watched as she spoke to nurses not as a benefactor, but as a colleague. She knew their names. She knew the children's stories. She pointed out that while the hospital was fundraising for a new MRI machine, the nurses were struggling with a broken ice machine in the oncology ward, and the parents sleeping in the visitors' lounge had nowhere to get a decent cup of coffee. Her first proposal was not for a 6-figure piece of equipment. It was for a $5,000 project to completely refurbish the family lounge, including comfortable sleeping chairs, a new commercial-grade coffee machine, and 2 new top-of-the-line ice machines for the nursing stations. Because sometimes, she explained to the board, her voice resonating with an empathy that was so much like Arthur's, helping the patient means helping the family that sits by their bedside. It means helping the nurse who is on her feet for 12 hours straight. The proposal was passed unanimously. Leo and Chloe had to raise their hands in assent, their faces impassive. They were voting for their daughter's idea, a quiet, effective act of kindness that was a silent rebuke to their own grand, hollow ambitions. Watching them, I felt not triumph, but a deep, aching sadness for what my son had lost. He had lost his connection to his father's legacy, and now he was losing the respect of his own daughter. Sophia and I became a team. She brought the energy and the fresh eyes. I brought the experience and the guiding hand. Our bond, which had always been warm, deepened into a true partnership. In working with her, the wound of Leo's betrayal began to heal. I saw that my values, Arthur's values, had not been lost. They had simply skipped a generation. The legacy was safe. It was alive, and it was growing. One afternoon, after a long day visiting a local food bank, Sophia and I were sitting in my kitchen, drinking tea from the forget-me-not cups. You know, Grandma, she said, looking around the familiar room. I used to be so afraid this would all just disappear, that the stories you told me about Grandpa and the foundation would just become old stories, but they're not. We're still writing them. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was strong and capable. Yes, my dear, I said, my heart full. We are. The phone didn't ring with angry demands anymore. The doorbell didn't herald another confrontation. My home was my own again. My life was my own again. I had faced the end of my purpose and, in the process, had found a new beginning. The smard, the years that followed, were quiet, but it was a productive quiet. The foundation flourished under the combined guidance of my experience and Sophia's vibrant, compassionate energy. The junior advisory board became a powerhouse of ideas, bringing us small, impactful projects that we never would have found on our own. We funded a mobile library for rural communities, a coding camp for underprivileged girls, a therapeutic garden at a veterans hospital. The Arthur Legacy Fund name never made the headlines, but in the small corners of the world where it mattered, it was spoken with gratitude and respect. Leo and Chloe remained on the board, ghosts at the feast. They attended the meetings, cast their silent votes in favor of Sophia's meticulously researched proposals, and left without a word. I don't know what their life was like outside that room. I know Chloe threw herself into other, more glamorous charities where her talents for organizing parties were better appreciated. Leo seemed to age, the confident swagger he'd learned from his wife slowly eroding, leaving behind a man who looked quiet and tired. We were polite. We exchanged pleasantries at holidays for Sophia's sake. But the chasm that had opened between us never closed. There are some betrayals that are too deep to be bridged by a simple apology, and none was ever offered. I learned to live with the quiet ache of it. Sophia, however, was a constant source of joy. She didn't just play the part of a young philanthropist. She lived it. She chose to study social work at university, wanting to understand the systemic issues behind the problems we were trying to solve. Every break, every summer, she was back, working not just for the foundation, but in the shelters and clinics we supported. She was building her own legacy, brick by brick, on the foundation Arthur and I had laid. The day of her 21st birthday arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. It was also, fittingly, the day of our quarterly board meeting. Before the meeting, we had a small celebration in the office. Sophia, flushed and happy, blew out the candles on a simple cake Mr. Pike had bought for her. As she cut the first slice, I watched my son watch his daughter. There was a look on Leo's face I hadn't seen in years, a pure, uncomplicated expression of fatherly pride and a profound, quiet sadness. For a moment, I saw the man he might have been. When we convened in the boardroom, I took my seat and called the meeting to order. We went through the usual business. Then, I cleared my throat. "And now, for the final item on the agenda," I said, a prepared document resting in front of me. "It is an item I have been considering for some time." I looked around the table, at George, now in a wheelchair but his eyes as sharp as ever, at the other members, and finally at Sophia, who was looking at me with curiosity. "This foundation," I began, "was created to last beyond a single lifetime. It was built on the idea of a continuing legacy. For years, I have been its sole guardian, but it is time to formally plan for its future." I paused. "I am proposing a final amendment to the charter, an amendment to designate a successor to the role of sole signatory. This role will be automatically conferred upon my retirement or my death." I let the weight of those words settle. Then I looked directly at my granddaughter. "I propose that upon the successful completion of her university degree, Miss Sophia Wallace be named my successor." A wave of emotion washed over Sophia's face, shock, honor, the terrifying weight of responsibility. She looked at me, her eyes wide. "Grandma, she began, her voice trembling slightly. "You have earned it, Sophia," I said softly, but with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "You have proven, time and again, that you understand the soul of this foundation better than anyone. You are not just my granddaughter. You are the living embodiment of your grandfather's values. This is not a gift. It is a recognition of who you are." I turned to the board. "I am putting this to a vote." George didn't even wait for me to finish. "Aye," he said, his voice booming in the quiet room. One by one, every other hand went up. "Aye, aye, aye." It was unanimous. Even Leo, his face a mixture of regret and acceptance, raised his hand. After the vote was recorded and the meeting adjourned, there was a moment of quiet celebration. The other board members crowded around Sophia, congratulating her, shaking her hand. I stood back, watching, a feeling of profound peace settling over me. My work was done. As people began to file out, Leo approached me. Chloe was not with him. She had made a hasty exit as soon as the meeting ended. He stood before me, looking not at me, but at his daughter, who was now talking animatedly with George. "You were right, Mom," he said, his voice so quiet I could barely hear it. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. "About everything. She's the right choice. She's more like Dad than I ever was." It wasn't an apology. It was a confession. It was an admission of his own failure, and a recognition of his daughter's worth. He had chosen glitter over substance, and now he knew the true cost of that choice. It was all he could offer me, and I found, to my surprise, that it was enough. "Yes, she is," I said simply. He nodded, a final, sad little gesture, and then he walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When everyone else had gone, Sophia came over to me. Mr. Pike had already brought out the old, leather-bound charter and inserted the newly printed and signed amendment. The smell of old leather and fresh ink mingled in the air. I picked up the heavy book. It was the story of my life with Arthur, the repository of our shared dreams. I ran my hand over the worn cover one last time. "This is yours now," I said, holding it out to her. "Guard it well." She took it from me, holding it in her hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. She looked down at it, then up at me, her eyes full of tears and a fierce, burning pride. "I will, Grandma," she whispered. "I promise." I had finally become what they had tried to force upon me all those years ago, founder emeritus. But now, it was not a title of exile, but a badge of honor, freely and consciously chosen. I had saved the past, and I had secured the future. I looked at my granddaughter, standing there holding our family's legacy in her hands, her face illuminated by the afternoon light pouring through the boardroom window. And I thought, Arthur would be so happy. His legacy was never about the money in the bank. It was about the fire in her eyes. And in that moment, I was finally, completely at peace.